roll into the next one. Under the Lectern. First drafted in the summer of 2017, immediately after attending Under the Volcano 70 Years On, a Malcom Lowry conference. Malcom Lowry, 1909 to 1957, published 2 novels during his lifetime, Ultramarine, 1933, and Under the Volcano, 1947. The first was written while he was a Cambridge undergraduate and was about his gap year, which even at the time wasn't that original a concept. After graduating from his fancy university, Lowry went off the rails, living in Cuernavaca, Mexico, as his first marriage deteriorated, and then in a shack just outside Vancouver once he'd remarried. Lowry was an alcoholic who'd switched from terrible binges to strict sobriety, working concurrently on multiple projects in bursts of creativity that he couldn't sustain, barely finishing any of his potential books. There was one major exception. Under the Volcano, broadly considered by those who've read it a masterpiece, took Lowry almost a decade to write, rewrite, edit, and complete, and he still noted potential edits years after publication. During the 2.5 decades between his undergraduate novels publication and his death by misadventure in a dull little village in Sussex, he developed a huge array of prose and poetic works, barely any of which made it into print until after his death. The cachet of Lowry's unpublished manuscripts included texts such as Hear Us, O Lord, from Heaven Thy Dwelling Place, and Lunar Caustic, the first a collection of short stories and the second novella, both of which were almost finished, and in fact Lunar Caustic was published in a French translation in 1955. Even after its French publication, though, Lowry continued to edit the original text. There have been the standard dead writer publications of poems and letters, plus 2 novels edited from his notes by his second wife, Marjorie Bonner, which are called Dark as the Grave, Wherein My Friend Is Laid, which is great, and October Ferry to Gabriola, less great. More recently, there have been academic editions published of less complete texts, including the novels In Progress, In Ballast to the White Sea, and La Mordida, as well as a bizarre screenplay of Tender as the Night that he and his wife worked on for a very long time without having been commissioned. It's basically a novel-length prose description of a film, think Jeff Dyer's Zona, but one that doesn't exist. The imagined film combines the narrative of Fitzgerald's best novel, in my opinion, with narratives from Lowry's own life and fiction. If it had been deliberately written as a piece of postmodern experimentalism, it would be lauded. However, as it was a self-conscious, let's make Hollywood money scheme from people with no understanding of standard ways to format a screenplay, it's ended up merely a literary curiosity for the Lowry superfan. Lowry wrote a lot, but finished little. His writing deeply affecting and often beautiful, but he rarely felt confident that he'd achieved with it what he wanted. Lowry wrote because he wanted to make art, but his perfectionist streak was more accurately a neurosis. He wanted to write and be read, but he did not feel himself good enough to deserve either. Alas, Lowry died from an overdose of alcohol and prescription medication ahead of his time, a decade after the internationally lauded Under the Volcano was released, having not published another book other than that French translation of Lunar Caustic. Lowry was tragic. Lowry's life was bleak. I find his texts, which are heady reflections of his life, deeply fascinating. And that is why I booked myself a place at Under the Volcano 70 Years On, a Malcom Lowry conference at Liverpool John Moores University at the end of July 2017. It was an academic conference by academics for academics, but I am not an academic. I don't quite know what I am, to be honest, but I thought an academic conference might distract me from my age-inappropriate ennui for a few days. I recently had a breakdown, and before I hit rock bottom, I considered applying for a PhD. I never expected to want this, as when I completed my MA, I felt committed to never setting foot in an educational institution again. As my life took multiple negative turns, though, I found myself looking back to the year I spent doing little more than reading and writing about books as a halcyon period, ignoring the voices in my head saying things like, academia isn't real. Academia is an art gallery. Academia isn't real, especially postgraduate English literature. Reading and writing about books isn't engaging with the world, is it? You'd be living an idealistic life off the back of undergraduates paying sky-high fees for an education. Academics write for other academics. It's a closed circle, only ever pierced by outsiders when they skim-read academic texts as undergraduates to crowbar quotations into essays they've already written or bought from the internet. Academics inhabit a monk-like role outside of normal society. It would be Peter Panning, wouldn't it? Which isn't good, right? Get a job. Academia isn't lucrative. Money, though inherently evil, has its uses, and some of those uses are fun. You enjoy travel, don't you? And other than traveling to conferences, academics are tied to their libraries, right? Academia would get boring. You like books and you like writing about books, but there's no way you'd find the same things fascinating for the length of a career, is there? Look at your actual fucking CV. I was desperate to escape the depressed hole I was sinking into, so defied these voices and booked my ticket to this academic conference to see how I liked dipping my fingertip in the water. By the time the conference rolled around, my mental health had caused me to lose my home, my job, my long-term relationship, and any belief that I could ever achieve anything. As a gift to my more optimistic, younger self, I still got on the train to Liverpool, even though it meant leaving my dog behind in London. That evening, a few steps away from Liverpool's bombed-out Church of St. Luke, I sat alone in my cheap Airbnb room, swiping right on every Liverpudlian woman Tinder offered me, until I reached its daily limit. I didn't get a single match, which was probably for the best. I went to bed early, mournfully masturbated, and fell asleep thinking of my dog. I arrived at the Liverpool John Moores University at 9 a.m. and threw myself at the free coffee and biscuits. With my mouth full, I worried about how much I stood out, not only because of my shaved head and bright patterned clothes, which made me stand out in most places outside of Hackney, but also because of my age. Of the 50 or so people in attendance, there were at absolute maximum 4 people there under 40, and I, then 28, was at least 5 years younger than all but one of those. Lowry is clearly not attracting young academics. Or maybe he is, but not in the UK or at any overseas universities that cover travel costs for PhD candidates studying a dead English drunk. Because, though it wasn't youthful, it was a very international conference. There were several speakers from both the UK and Canada, the latter home to the Lowry Archive, and others from countries including New Zealand, Spain, and Belgium. Lowry's inspired academics in many parts of the world, and though the speeches differed in their opinions, all of them shared a real interest in the work and life of this writer from the Wirral. The delegation was also much less male and pale than I'd been expecting, which somehow made me feel better about myself. The first speaker was Cheryl Grace, a Canadian academic who spoke at length about the links between Lowry and other writers, and how there's something intense and serious in his work that speaks with potency to many people. Some of the speeches were engaging in the way I'd hoped, energetic, urgent, personal, but others veered towards the kind of off-putting academies I'd been worried the whole conference would consist of. One speech included the phrase, "place is inherently mobile," which I copied into my notes with the annotation, "no it isn't." Then again, that speech went on to say that, possibly paraphrasing, my notes don't clarify, colonialism is a history of spoliation, which is inarguably accurate. Of the 17 or so speakers, most offered insights into readings of Lowry's text that I'd never considered. An especially engaging text lecture from someone called Ben Clark discussed the ways that class informs Lowry's portrayals of life at sea. Lowry spent his gap year as a sailor, and how Lowry's writing is more focused on the myth of the sea than its reality. There were lectures on Lowry's interest in cinema, on his interest in the Kabbalah, on his use of ashes as a recurring motif, and on the way he is haunted by books. A speaker called Chris Ackley spoke about the importance and pleasures of rigorous readings, while Belgian academic Vic Doyen discussed editing the in-progress manuscripts of October Ferry to Gabriola in the pursuit of a version that he believes Lowry could have considered complete. All these lectures, ranging in length from 20 minutes to about an hour, came from people who care passionately and deeply about literature and about Lowry in particular, just like me. And given the price of admission, it was incredible value for money. For just over £50, I received 10 hours of lectures, a live music gig, a coach tour of the Wirral where Lowry grew up, multiple free tequilas and several wines and beers, 2 meals, barrel loads of tea and coffee, and many, many little packs of, to be fair, cheap biscuits. How was the Malcom Lowry conference so cheap, I wondered? Because it's subsidized, as too were all the academics in attendance. These people only get to do this, read books, write essays, travel across the world to read the essays, because the undergraduate student fees of thousands of people, in combination with government and charitable grants, pay for their salaries. And even though I know this is how academia works, there's something about undergraduates' fees being used to supply non-entities like myself with free tequila that makes me deeply uncomfortable. The fact that there was free booze felt inappropriate. Lowry was an alcoholic. His life, and lest we forget his literary output, was ravaged by drinking. Lowry would have loved a free bar, but he also would have hated himself for succumbing to it. I had just about enough alcohol to stop feeling too shy to socialize, which is about the same amount that means I'm too intoxicated to socialize without risk of embarrassment. So I left early to return home to another 10 minutes of fruitless Tinder swiping. Boo-hoo. Although the Malcom Lowry conference wasn't peopled solely by heterosexual white middle-aged men, there was one demographic in which there seemed to be essentially zero variety, and that was class. Everyone present had that sense of entitlement to intellectual engagement with cultural products that is characteristic of not being working class. There was no mention of the mountains of student debt this subsidized event relied on, or the fact that academic essays on Lowry are only read by, at best, the delegates in this room and maybe the same amount of people outside of it. The many subsidize the few. Academia is a microcosm of society itself, but it is the ability to accrue knowledge for knowledge's sake, rather than money, that gets funneled upwards. I obviously heard no regret from academics in their 60s and 70s about having dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge in lieu, for example, of the pursuit of cash. There was no shame from these people for having been able to dedicate their entire lives to cultural study when, in the same world, people die from a lack of food and basic medication. The academics, the readers, the thinkers, some professionals, some like me, amateur, were all linked by class and intellectual interest. These people included the best Malcom Lowry scholars in the world, and I was able to listen to them talk, and it was amazing. Even though in my head I was simultaneously worrying about money, my future, my health, my dog, my parents, and everything else I usually worry about. For weeks before the conference, I'd been unable to read or write due to my terrible mental health, and seeing people who present themselves as if they never stop reading and writing, despite the continual shit the world flings towards fans, my disgust at their disconnect evaporated and rained down as something else. There's a footnote here about student debt. I began university in the last years of the new Labour government, so my debts began at only about £30,000. My sister, who went to higher education after the Lib Dems had reneged on their key manifesto pledge to not raise student tuition fees, graduated owing almost twice that. Under the system as it operated then, my sister and I were entitled to extra-large student loans due to our parents' low income, which, though low, was slightly too high for us to receive any but the tiniest of debt-free grants. These extra-large loans still presumed sizable handouts from a student's parents, which wasn't an option for us. So I worked throughout my undergraduate degree, and my sister lived with our parents. As you can imagine, both of these choices severely impacted on the value we took from our courses. I love the works of Malcom Lowry, but I lack the talent, persistence, and let's be honest, readership to make writing about Lowry a viable commercial concern. I write about books all the time, mostly for free, and I love doing it. But I write about books when I'm not exerting my energy on things I've been culturally conditioned to value more, i.e. trying to accrue capital. Writing about books very rarely makes me money, and yet I spend more time doing it than just about any other activity in my life. When I'm doing paid, usually menial work, I'm often distracted by thoughts of literature, and knowing that I will get to sit down with a good piece of prose or poetry is what I've always used to get through the depressing realities of my rarely pleasant day-to-day existence. When I look to my future, my first concern is, where will I live and how will I pay for it? Answering this question trumps all other concerns. Successful academics haven't got to their position by worrying about cash. I don't mean that every academic was born into money, but that every academic, all of whom are in theory intelligent and articulate individuals, have chosen to not use their intelligence to pursue wealth, but rather to pursue knowledge. You don't climb the academic ladder because you want to be wealthy. You get tenure and thus some kind of security because your work is deemed important for whatever reason to the department. Nobody makes great art or anything else while they're distracted. Even the anxious, depressed, and addicted people who make great art drift outside of their problems when they sit down to write, paint, sculpt, or sing. Like Lowry, for example. Academics are medieval monks, producing texts only for a privileged few, but like monks, they have a strength of purpose and a belief in the importance of their choice. No one becomes an academic by accident. It's competitive and bureaucratic and poorly paid relative to other careers that demand intensive long-term study. And to my depressed, unfulfilled eyes, all the academics at the conference were happy and engaged, and even when they disagreed with each other, they argued with light and fire in their eyes. These weren't people embarrassed by a lifetime spent inside books. They were fired up and embiggened because they'd spent a lifetime inside books. I'd love to leap into academia and write on books and think about books and do nothing else. But I know I'd worry too much about interdepartmental politics, about budgeting, about staff assessments, and about tawdry, bullshit little pointless things that distract and detract from potential intellectual engagement. And maybe, in reality, that's the life of most of these academics. But that isn't what defines them to outsiders like myself. And that isn't the side of their life that is evidenced in books and at conferences and on their CVs. Someone with an academic career may have spent a lot of time doing paperwork, marking, teaching, and rewriting the same old opinion for different journals, but they're doing all of this for the opportunity to read and think and discuss and engage, to be engaged, to have that engagement as your identity, as your purpose, to be allowed to do reading books for a living, even if that requires administrative external bullshit. Imagine it, reading for a living. It sounds too good to be true. Maybe it is. I envy these academics, their determination, their focus, their refusal to give up and manage a bank or a shop or a restaurant or a cinema or something. Academia may be a withdrawal from the world of work, but it's an enviable withdrawal. I wish I felt my thinking and writing was more important than everything else in my life, but I don't. Maybe I would be happiest if I dropped everything and moved to Vancouver to bury myself in the Lowry archive and write a thesis that less than 50 people would ever read. But this doesn't feel like something I can let myself do. I had a psychological collapse because I'm bad at listening to myself, because I internalize criticism that I need to ignore, because I pretended that my own happiness didn't need to be an active concern in my life. Why do I feel that academia is invalid when it is the mode of existence that best matches what I want from my time on Earth? Or do I only want it because all I know of it is an idea, a stereotype, daydreams of leafy quadrangles, somewhere with a sea breeze, mornings spent lecturing, afternoons spent writing, the evenings spent cracking open a small bottle of gin and marking undergraduate essays? It sounds like bliss, blissful, unrealistic bliss. In theory, every single academic essay seeks to do something more important than the work I do for money. Every essay should seek to explore, expand, and share knowledge. And it is knowledge that makes us more than animal, because without books, we would have no history, no science, no culture. And without these things, we would be nothing but living automatons, like bees, like maggots, like ants. But are academics the only people who write books? No, of course not. Many academics churn out essays for no purpose other than to hit publishing targets as part of their contracts, which surely invalidates the whole justification for academia. If an academic is just another commodifiable employee who has targets to hit, then what the fuck is the point? Surely, every academic must have the intention of expanding human knowledge, because this, as a pursuit in itself, is something valuable. Far more than most of us seek to achieve when we clock in for work. When I've finished writing today, I'm going to work for just above minimum wage in a precarious job, earning only just enough money to cover food, dog insurance, and the other few things I require to stay alive. I don't know if I want to live in a world where even the people whose work is meant to be more than this approach their day-to-day lives with the same attitude. If academia is a career, not a calling, then it's no better than the demeaning hospitality work I do for money. And if academia isn't a beacon of the best of our species, what is? If academia is a capitalist pursuit, then why don't we just smash the walls and gorge on cement orgies until we explode? If the pursuit of knowledge isn't sacred, then nothing is sacred. And if nothing is sacred, then everything is dust. I know that I contribute nothing to bolster humanity with my professional time. I like to think that academics and scholars intend and attempt to do something of merit every time they sit down to think. I like to think that every time an essay is produced, even if nobody reads or learns from it, its intention was pure. But it probably wasn't. Because if there's no better life to aspire to, maybe I was right to have always been depressed. Maybe the depression and the self-hatred is a justifiable response. And that can't be true, as it's an idea rooted in the kind of opinions that only dickheads have. I've long felt there's an alternative, an elusive world of thoughtful abstraction that I can't enter because I'm trapped outside it by my anxieties about money and social interactions and health and sex and my dog and politics and terrorism. And I thought about becoming an academic while suicidal because I thought it might hold the potential for a perfect life. I hate the real world and would love to wall myself up away from it, like in the bell jar, but more successfully. I don't want to kill myself, but I don't want to live in the world in which I'm alive. I think I'd be happier if I could climb a hallowed spire and establish myself at the top with a library, but I think I'd still get distracted looking out the windows and feeling hungry and horny and thirsty and guilty. My mind isn't pure enough, focused enough, detached enough to be an academic. I'd love for my life to be centered on literature, but then I'd never eat, I'd never walk my dog, and I'd never get to travel. My outsider perspective of the academic life is fantastical, I know that. But I also know that it's not something I'll ever know more intimately because I've been culturally conditioned to see it as not for me. Maybe my love of literature, my piss-poor mental health, my interest in Lowry, a man from a wealthy family who lived in near poverty, and my envy of academia all come from the same root. My class displacement felt when, most of a lifetime ago, I rocked up to a rural grammar school as the Brummie-accented child of an unskilled labourer. If my formative years hadn't been filled with people dismissing my voice, maybe I'd be an adult who trusted their own opinions more. I'm jealous of the idea of academics, is what I'm trying to say. I think I'd like to be one, but I don't really know what one is. And I don't want to burst the imaginative bubble by finding out. I've been firmly made to feel that academia is not a choice for me. I've been made to feel that avarice is not a sin, that instead its absence is. I can't be an academic because the only academic I'd want to be couldn't possibly exist. I don't know what to do. I don't know who to be. I am sad and confused. I am